Good morning, everyone. Today we'll talk about the project stakeholder. It's a part 3 of chapter 2. So basically, let's define first who are your stakeholders or the stakeholders of any project. So any person who has interest in the project outcome and who can affect and be affected by the project is a stakeholder. So we can divide them into internal and external stakeholders. In this case, we can have members of the project team, the project managers, the executives, the project sponsors, customers, and users, etc. Stakeholders are individuals who either care about or have a vested interest in the project. So they are the people who are actively involved with the work of the project or have something in order to either gain or lose as a result of the project. When you manage a project to add lane, for example, to a highway motorist to highway, motorists are stakeholders, but these stakeholders are positively affected, okay? Nevertheless, a resident who live nearby the highway during the project, so either for the construction noise and then later on the traffic noise and the pollution, they are also stakeholders, but they will be negatively affected by the project. So you can have also stakeholders that can be affected positively or negatively, and stakeholder who can affect the project either positively or negatively. So another type of stakeholders, for example, is a project sponsor. So project sponsor, in general, it has the authority to assign resources and enforce decisions regarding the project. Also, it is a stakeholder. And it's the one who delivers money. So you have the customers, the subcontractors, the suppliers, even the government also are the stakeholder. For any project, if you wanted to build, for example, you need a license from the government. So in this case, it's a stakeholder. The project manager, the project team members, the family of the project team members, the managers from other departments in the organization also are stakeholders. So in any project, we have both internal and external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders may include top management, project team manager, managers, peers, resource managers, internal customers. As for external stakeholders, it may include external customers, government, contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers. So let's list a little bit of the project stakeholders, such as the project manager, the project coordinator. In general, project coordinator has a weaker role than the PM. In general, we can find it in weak and matrix organization or functional one. It's not allowed to make budget decision or overall project decision. It acts more as a communication link to senior management. We have third, the project expediters that have no formal authority. It's the weakest form of project management. Fourth type of stakeholder is the senior management. So the management in general had prioritized project, make sure that the project manager had the proper authority and resources. He was the one who issues strategic plans and goals and make sure that the company's projects are aligned with them. Maybe call upon to resolve conflict within the organization with the sponsor, with the customer, or with the different managers. So here we have an example of senior management role. In general, he resolves conflict over priorities. This conflict over priorities happen between the functional manager, who's worried more about day-to-day priorities, and the project manager, who's more about the project priorities in order to finalize it within the budget, within the scope, and within the time duration. The fifth stakeholder is the sponsor. So sponsor is the person who brings money to the table. So in general, we're talking about here the sponsor. The sixth one is a functional manager. Functional manager in general is a departmental manager. It could be manager of engineering, it could be director of marketing, it could be department head, it could be IT manager, etc. In general, the functional manager are a very rich source of expertise and information available to the project manager and can make valuable contribution to the project. The functional manager in general usually owns the resources that are loaned to the project and has a human resources responsibilities for them. Functional manager may have conflict with the PM, with the project manager. As for project team members, so any team member is a project stakeholder. They could be the developers, the analyzers, the construction personnel, the engineers. So any team member in general is a stakeholder, and in general is typically built to the project. So project staff should know enough about his work. He does not need to be micromanaged. This is a project team member. So basically, as you notice, in the stakeholder hierarchy, the customer is not is king. It's not a king. So basically, let's see this comic. I like it. For example, what do you mean? The customer is king? As here, no. Why? Because if the customer wants you to violate the law, would you violate the law? No. In this case, the government wins. The government is one of your stakeholders. So if the customer wants you to do something that would harm the owners financially and or their reputation, so basically, would you do it? The owner, no. So the owners win. But why do customers outrank employees and our own suppliers? They are outsourcing work and their needs drive the deal. So unless it violates any of the other higher level stakeholders' requirements. So basically, this comic show that and the customer is not a king, at least in the stakeholder hierarchy. We have to make sure to satisfy all the different stakeholders. We will see later on that to certain priority, we will prioritize them, but we have to take into consideration each stakeholder. So now let's go to the practical activity concerning this part of the chapter. The practical activity, so you have chosen projects, so you have to brainstorm together and to identify the different stakeholders. So different stakeholders mean the internal and external one. So you can have the team members, the family of the team members, the project manager, the senior manager, the technical, the engineers, developers. You can have the suppliers, the procurers, the government in this case, external one, etc. So brainstorm and identify all the stakeholders of your project. Second, prioritize these stakeholders based on expertise, willingness, and value. So in the expertise, you have the contribution and legitimacy. The contribution mainly, it's a knowledge of your stakeholder in X issue in your project, which is a value for your project. So basically, will he contribute to the project? His contribution is high, medium, low. You put the name of the stakeholder in the stakeholder column, and then you put in the contribution column if he will contribute high, medium, or low based on his knowledge and expertise in a certain field. It's related to the project or not. So the second column is legitimacy. So basically, is the stakeholders that will directly be affected by the company's activity. So it's affected by the company's or the project activity. So by the project. So yes, for example, for the team member or project manager, it's very high legitimacy. But for example, for the family of the person, it's not. It should be low. For example, the government, it depends if the project is very big that can affect, for example, a city. So in this case, it's high. But if it's a very small project, it could be medium or low. Willingness, it's how much your stakeholder is willing to engage. Some sponsor, for example, give you the money for the project, but they don't want to they invest, but they don't want to deal. They want just the result at the end of their project. So in this case, they are not willing to engage. In this case, it should be low. Other sponsor, for example, will be willing to engage and to follow in details. The same, for example, project manager should be has very high willing to engage, for example. Nevertheless, the government, maybe it's not willing to engage if the project is not related to the government. It's just only you need a certificate or a form from the government, etc. The fourth column, it's the influence. So, for example, the press is a stakeholder that a very high influence. So basically, it has very high influence. Nevertheless, for example, let's take an example, family of team members, they have very low influence on the project. For the necessity of involvement, so basically, if the stakeholder is an outspoken or stakeholder or not. So basically here, if it's not an outspoken stakeholder, he has low necessity of involvement. Otherwise, he can have a high necessity of involvement in the project, such as project manager sure has high necessity of involvement. For example, a sponsor, it could be low necessity of involvement, a specific sponsor. So what you have to do is you prioritize your stakeholders based on this table, so their expertise, willingness, and value, and then you map these stakeholders in this chart, where you put, so in the x-axis, the willingness from low to high, and the y-axis is expertise from low to high, and then you put in circle, and the circle size represents the value of its low, medium, or high of the stakeholders. And notice the stakeholders can affect each other. So basically, for example, the press can affect the government. So basically, you will see that an arrow going from the press to the government. This will show the interaction between the different stakeholders. So for example, the developers will affect the project manager. Okay, the technician will affect, for example, the team members, etc. So now that you did the mapping of your stakeholders, you go in order to develop the power interest grid analysis in order to identify the key stakeholders by answering these questions. First, what level of power do your stakeholder have? Second, what level of interest do they have? So basically, first, you should ask, how important is it that they are happy with the project progress and result? How integral are they to the project success? How influential are they to the project, to the other stakeholders, to the team, and so on? So, and the stakeholder influence can be positive and could be negative. The second question you can ask about each stakeholder, what level of interest do they have? So if the project is very interesting for them, or just like very simple projects they know or they work with or they collaborate or they sponsor best in. Is it something they are directly accounted for? So for example, project manager will be directly accounted for the level for the project. Are they reliant on it for other work or result? Are they opposed to the project or concerned about it in some way? So all of these questions could be answered. So as you can see now, you can have the power interest grid. In the power interest grid, so basically you will have in the x interest and in the y-axis power. So you see, you map these stakeholders and you see that the most powerful one that you should make sure not to disappoint the stakeholders, they are the ones who are powerful and interested in the project. So these persons who are powerful and interested in the project, you should manage them very closely. You should keep them not only satisfied, informed, and manage them very closely and just be very close to them. Otherwise, you will have, for example, high power, low interest, you keep them satisfied. High interest, low power, you keep them informed, and you can monitor the low interest and the low power. So now that you know who are the key players and the key stakeholders, basically from this analysis, you can involve to meeting them face-to-face interview and conversation in order to discuss things, for example, like what's the definition, how they view the project, how they view if it was successful or not, is there any concern or reservation they have about the project or its outcome, what are their expectations for the project, what impact, is it positive or negative, whether there are any anticipated conflict of interest with other stakeholders that you need to be aware of, etc. So all these questions could be asked for the stakeholders. That's it. So now you have this checkpoint to deliver. At the end, we'll give you the deadline on the e-learning. You have a PowerPoint presentation to deliver that could be between 5 to 8 minutes maximum, covering all these fields.